My name is Courtney, and that night was supposed to be a celebration until it turned into a public mockery. My sister took control of the stage with a microphone in her hand and a triumphant smile that sent a chill down my spine. She motioned for me to come forward and receive a large, beautifully wrapped gift, claiming it was the perfect reward for my meager efforts over the years. The wealthy guests whispered behind their hands as I climbed the steps to accept the box she shoved toward me. I lifted the lid and found it completely empty, triggering a wave of cruel laughter that spread through the crowd. She leaned into the microphone and declared that the emptiness symbolized my financial future without her constant charity. Instead of breaking down in tears, as she clearly expected, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick legal file I had prepared. I placed the incriminating documents inside her empty box and snapped the lid shut. I leaned close to her ear and whispered that I was returning the truth to her, then turned my back on the stage. As I walked toward the grand exit with my head held high, a blood-curdling scream erupted behind me when she finally realized what I had left her. The sound of her terror was immediately drowned out by the piercing wail of police sirens surrounding the entire estate. Do you think I did the right thing, or did I go too far? If you were in my position, how would you react? Leave your comment below. 6 months before that police siren tore through the freezing night, my life still revolved around numbers and ledgers in my father's office. I was the only person who genuinely understood the intricate financial web of our family construction empire, while my sister Valerie treated the corporate accounts like her personal infinite bank for lavish parties. My father trusted me with every confidential negotiation and strategic decision because he knew I valued the legacy he built far more than the luxury it provided us. We were in the middle of a high-stakes quarterly budget meeting regarding the new harbor development project when the tragedy that changed everything suddenly struck. The color drained from his face as he gasped for air before slumping forward onto the heavy mahogany conference table with a sickening thud. I remember screaming for the board members to call an ambulance immediately while I desperately tried to find a pulse beneath his dress shirt. He was rushed to the emergency room, where the doctors informed me that he had suffered a massive stroke and slipped into a deep coma. I spent 3 sleepless days pacing the sterile hospital waiting room while praying for him to wake up and return to us. However, Valerie was already plotting her ascent to the throne, while I was too distracted by grief to notice her maneuvering. She marched into the intensive care unit accompanied by my brother-in-law Derek, who was wearing a suit that cost more than my annual salary. They presented a power of attorney document to the hospital administration that featured a signature so shaky it looked nothing like Dad's firm handwriting. Derek smirked as he informed the head physician that they were now legally in charge of both the medical decisions and the company assets. I tried to argue that Dad would never sign such a thing without consulting me, but the hospital legal team said their hands were tied by the paperwork. I returned to the office the following morning determined to protect the business from their inevitable incompetence, only to discover something far more sinister than bad management. I noticed several irregular transfers draining the capital from our most critical infrastructure project during a routine audit of the weekly expenses. I spent hours tracing the digital footprint until I found undeniable proof that Derek was funneling millions into offshore accounts to cover his massive gambling debts. It became clear that they intended to bleed the company dry before anyone else realized what was happening to the finances. I gathered every single transaction log and bank statement into a binder before storming into the executive suite to confront them about the embezzlement. I found Derek sitting in my father's leather chair with his feet up on the desk, while Valerie was busy browsing a catalog for private jets. I slammed the heavy file onto the desk and demanded they explain why they were stealing from the very company that paid for their extravagant lifestyle. I expected them to be ashamed or at least frightened by the undeniable evidence of criminal fraud I held in my hands. Instead of apologizing, Valerie smiled that cold smile I hated and produced a folder of her own containing falsified emails sent from my server. She accused me of forging documents and leaking confidential blueprints to our competitors to destroy my credibility before I could expose them. Derek laughed as he poured himself a drink and told me that the board had already voted to remove me based on the evidence she had forged. I tried to reach for the phone to call our corporate lawyers, but Valerie leaned across the desk to deliver her final ultimatum regarding my future. She threatened to terminate the funding for the life support machines keeping Dad alive if I did not sign a full waiver of my inheritance immediately. The cruelty in her eyes told me that she would not hesitate to let him die just to secure her control over the money. I realized with a sinking heart that I had no choice but to surrender everything to save the only parent I had left. I forced the pen across the dotted line because saving his life was more important to me than any fortune or position in the company. They gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my personal belongings and vacate the premises before security escorted me out into the cold night with nothing but my clothes. 2 weeks after being kicked out of the Beacon Hill mansion, I found myself standing in front of the glass skyscraper belonging to Julian, my sister's biggest business rival. I had spent the last 14 miserable days living in a damp basement apartment in Southie that smelled constantly of mildew and leaking pipes. My personal bank accounts were completely frozen by the ruthless legal team Valerie controlled, so I was surviving on loose change and cheap instant noodles. I tried applying to other respectable firms in Boston, but every single door was slammed in my face because Valerie had spread vicious rumors about my professional integrity. She made sure everyone in the industry thought I was a thief who stole from her own dying father to cover up my incompetence. I realized as I looked at my dwindling cash that my only chance of survival was to align myself with the one person Valerie feared more than anyone else in the city. Julian was known for his ruthless business tactics, and his hatred for the Harrison family legacy was legendary in our elite circles. Walking into his imposing lobby felt like walking into a lion's den, but I had absolutely nothing left to lose except my wounded pride. I handed my resume to the receptionist who looked at my last name with widened eyes before making a frantic phone call upstairs to alert security. I was eventually escorted into the corner office where my sister's enemy sat behind a desk made of glass and steel, looking at me with pure contempt. He didn't offer me a seat or a glass of water because he clearly viewed my presence as an insult to his intelligence. He tossed my resume onto the floor and leaned back in his chair while crossing his arms over his broad chest. He believed that I was a spy sent by my sister to infiltrate his operations and sabotage his upcoming deals from the inside. I stood there waiting for him to call the guards, but instead he decided to humiliate me personally. He looked me dead in the eye and asked, "You think I'll trust a Harrison? Your sister has played dirty with me for the last 5 years, so why should I hire you?" I stepped over my discarded resume and placed my hands flat on his desk to show him I wasn't afraid of his intimidation tactics. I replied, "Because I know exactly where Valerie hides the bad debts in the financial reports, and I know how to help you win the harbor project bid next week." The mention of the massive harbor project made his expression change from hostility to calculating interest because he knew that contract would secure his company's future for the next decade. He gave me a stack of unorganized bid documents and told me I had until sunrise to prove that I wasn't wasting his valuable time. I sat in a small conference room with only a pot of stale coffee and my intimate knowledge of Valerie's cost-cutting shortcuts to guide me through the long night. I combed through every single line of the proposal to find the critical error in her environmental compliance fees, which she had ignored to save money. I realized that she was planning to bribe the inspectors rather than pay for the necessary safety upgrades, which gave Julian the legal leverage he needed. We walked into the city council bidding meeting the next morning and watched the color drain from Valerie's face when she saw me sitting on the opposing side of the table. Julian presented the revised numbers I had calculated along with the safety projections that made Valerie's proposal look dangerously negligent. The city council awarded the multi-million-dollar contract to his firm immediately, while Valerie sat there in stunned silence. The victory felt hollow when I saw the sheer hatred burning in my sister's eyes as she aggressively packed up her rejected proposal files. She called Julian's office an hour later, screaming so loud that her voice could be heard through the receiver even from across the room. She threatened to sue both of us for breach of confidentiality and vowed to bury me under so many lawsuits that I would never breathe free air again. Julian simply laughed at her threats and offered me a permanent position as his strategic advisor with a salary that would finally get me out of that basement. One stormy night in the third month, my phone vibrated incessantly with an unknown number displaying from Massachusetts General Hospital. I was working late at Julian's office analyzing the quarterly projections when the buzzing broke the silence of the empty building. My heart hammered against my ribs because Valerie had strictly forbidden any medical staff from contacting me regarding my father's condition. I answered the call with trembling fingers to hear a familiar hushed voice on the other end that sounded terrified. It was Brenda, the loyal nurse who had cared for my father for over 20 years, and the only person in that facility I could still trust. She was whispering frantically from inside a supply closet because she knew the surveillance cameras monitored the hallways. She told me that the doctors had noticed significant brain activity earlier that evening, which indicated he was waking up. However, instead of celebrating this miracle, my sister had arrived with a new set of medical directives that would keep him permanently unconscious. Brenda's voice cracked with emotion as she delivered the chilling message. "Ms. Courtney, you must come immediately. The boss has woken up, but Valerie just ordered an increased dose of sedatives. I can't stop her much longer." I knew I couldn't just walk through the front door because Valerie had stationed private security guards to ensure I never got near him. I turned to Julian, who was watching me with concern, and quickly explained that my father was in immediate danger. He grabbed his car keys without hesitation and drove us through the blinding rain to the hospital entrance. Julian created a massive diversion at the main desk by loudly demanding to see the hospital administrator about a fictional lawsuit while his security team argued with Valerie's guards. I used the chaos to slip through the staff entrance and navigated the labyrinth of corridors toward the intensive care unit using the service elevator. I held my breath as the doors opened onto the fourth floor where the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors filled the heavy air. I crept past the nurse's station while the night staff was distracted by the commotion downstairs and slipped silently into room 405. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces when I saw the man who had built an empire lying there so frail and helpless. His skin was pale and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were open and focused on the ceiling with a clarity I hadn't seen in months. I approached the bed slowly and took his cold hand in mine, watching as his gaze shifted to meet mine with a sudden spark of recognition. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask covering his face muffled his weak voice. I carefully lowered the plastic mask so he could breathe freely for a moment, ignoring the alarms that might trigger at the nurse's station. He squeezed my hand with surprising strength, and tears began to pool in the corners of his eyes as he looked at me. He whispered that he was sorry for everything that had happened and admitted that his blindness to Valerie's greed had caused this entire disaster. He told me that he had hidden the only thing that could save our legacy in a place Valerie would never think to look, because she despised anything broken or old. He pulled me closer until his forehead touched mine and delivered the instructions that would change the course of this war. He gasped out the words, "Find the old wheelchair in the garage. The key is there. Take everything to Lawyer Henderson. Don't let your sister destroy my life's work." I promised him I would do exactly as he asked, but our moment was cut short by the sharp sound of high heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. I recognized that aggressive stride immediately and knew that Valerie was coming to ensure her orders were being followed. I kissed my father's forehead one last time and pulled the oxygen mask back over his face, just as the handle of the door began to turn. I rushed toward the narrow window that opened onto the metal fire escape and climbed out into the pouring rain. I pulled the window shut just as the door swung open, leaving me shivering on the wet metal grate with the secret that would finally bring my sister down. As the weak rays of the November morning sun pierced through the thick fog, I stood before the family's dilapidated old garage, which had been abandoned for years. This crumbling structure was the only location on the entire estate that Valerie had deemed unworthy of surveillance cameras because she considered it a graveyard for worthless junk. I had parked my car 3 blocks away and hiked through the overgrown woods to avoid triggering the perimeter alarms at the main gate. The air inside the garage was thick with dust and the smell of decaying wood that made my throat constrict as I began my desperate search. I navigated through piles of discarded furniture and broken garden tools until I spotted the familiar chrome frame of my father's old wheelchair tucked behind a stack of rotting tires. My hands were trembling uncontrollably from a mixture of adrenaline and the freezing temperature as I ran my fingers along the leather seat cushion. I pulled a small pocket knife from my jacket and carefully sliced through the stitching just as my father had instructed me to do during our secret meeting. My fingers brushed against cold metal and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding when I pulled out a small silver key that had been sewn securely into the padding. I wasted no time in leaving the estate and drove straight to the First National Bank to access the safety deposit box before anyone realized I had been there. The box contained a thick, leather-bound ledger detailing every illegal transaction Derek had made and a pristine envelope sealed with my father's personal wax crest. I clutched the documents to my chest and sped toward the downtown office of lawyer Henderson, who had been my father's most trusted legal counsel for over 40 years. Mr. Henderson was waiting for me with a grave expression as he spread the documents across his mahogany desk and began to read through the dense legal text. The silence in the room was deafening as he verified the dates and signatures against the notary records he kept in his private vault. He looked up at me over his reading glasses with a mixture of sorrow for my father's condition and fierce determination to see justice served. He tapped the document with his pen and said, "This will is completely legal, Courtney. It was made 2 days before his stroke. Valerie has no rights whatsoever, but we need to announce it at the right time." I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders, knowing that Valerie's reign of terror was built on nothing but lies and forgery. I thanked Mr. Henderson and stepped out onto the bustling city street, feeling empowered for the first time in 6 agonizing months. My phone suddenly vibrated in my pocket and I froze when I saw Valerie's name flashing on the screen. I took a deep breath to steady my nerves before answering because I knew she would be monitoring my reaction closely. Her voice floated through the speaker with a sickening sweetness that was completely different from the screeching tone she had used when I joined Julian's company. She didn't know that I held the weapon that would destroy her in my purse, so she continued with her charade. She purred into the phone. "Courtney, I know we've had misunderstandings. Come to the villa tonight. I have a surprise gift for you. Don't be late, my beloved sister." I stared at the phone in disbelief because the sheer audacity of her invitation was almost impressive in its wickedness. I knew exactly what this party was really about without needing to ask a single question. The company was scheduled to go public with an IPO next week, and she needed to present a united family front to the investors to boost the stock price. She wanted to lure me back to the house to humiliate me publicly and force me into a position where I appeared dependent on her generosity. She thought she was inviting a beaten dog back to the porch to beg for scraps in front of her wealthy friends. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag where the evidence of her crimes was safely tucked away. I decided right then and there that I would accept her invitation, but the surprise would not be for me. I was going to walk into that party and turn her carefully constructed stage into a courtroom where her judgment would be final. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, the massive wrought iron gates of the Harrison estate swung wide open to admit a parade of gleaming limousines belonging to Boston's upper crust. I stepped out of my modest sedan, which looked absurdly out of place, nestled between the chauffeur-driven Bentleys and Rolls-Royces lining the circular driveway. I had chosen to wear a simple black pantsuit that I had carefully pressed in my small apartment because I refused to give Valerie the satisfaction of seeing me look disheveled. The security guards at the entrance checked my name against the guest list with sneering expressions before reluctantly waving me through the heavy oak doors. The grand foyer was already buzzing with the low hum of expensive conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses as I made my way into the heart of the beast. I could feel the heavy weight of 100 judgmental eyes tracking my movement across the marble floor as whispers regarding my sudden appearance began to circulate among the crowd. These were the same business partners who had once shaken my hand firmly when my father was in charge, but now looked at me like I was a contagious disease. I kept my chin high and walked with a steady rhythm because I knew the truth that was hidden inside my bag was more powerful than their collective net worth. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray to occupy my trembling hands when a heavy body suddenly slammed into my shoulder with deliberate force. I gasped as a splash of dark red liquid soaked into the fabric of my white blouse and dripped onto my polished shoes. I looked up to see my brother-in-law standing there with an empty wine glass and a malicious grin plastered across his flushed face. Derek made a show of dusting off his expensive tuxedo jacket, while loudly lamenting the loss of his vintage Merlot to draw the attention of the nearby guests. He wanted to assert his dominance over me one last time before he threw me out with the scraps from the kitchen. He sneered down at me and announced to the room, "Look who it is, my failed sister-in-law. Hope you don't dirty my carpet with those cheap shoes." The chatter in the immediate vicinity died down instantly as people turned to watch the spectacle he was creating for their amusement. I fought the urge to slap the arrogance right off his face because I knew that losing my temper would only play into their narrative of my instability. Instead of shouting back or bursting into tears as he clearly hoped I would, I calmly reached into my purse for a napkin. I dabbed at the stain on my blouse with slow, methodical movements while locking my gaze directly onto his shifting eyes. I stared at him with such intense, unwavering coldness that his smirk faltered and a flicker of genuine nervousness crossed his features. He cleared his throat awkwardly and muttered something about me being clumsy before quickly turning away to find a fresh drink. He retreated into the crowd like a coward because deep down he sensed that the dynamic between us had shifted in a way he couldn't quite understand. I scanned the sea of faces for the one person in this room who wasn't waiting for my public execution. I spotted Julian standing near the terrace doors holding a glass of scotch and observing the scene with a detached professional interest. Valerie had invited him solely to gloat about her impending IPO launch and to rub her stolen success in his face one final time. He caught my eye across the crowded ballroom and gave a barely perceptible nod that spoke volumes to me in that moment. That tiny gesture confirmed that the forensic accounting team from the district attorney's office was positioned just beyond the perimeter wall waiting for my signal. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep my expression neutral as I realized the trap was finally set. The lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed as the jazz band on the stage ceased playing in the middle of a song. A bright spotlight cut through the darkness to illuminate the center stage where my sister was standing in a shimmering gold gown like a queen addressing her subjects. Valerie tapped the microphone to demand silence, and the room fell quiet in anticipation of her grand speech. She launched into a rehearsed monologue about family values and the importance of charity, which made my stomach churn with nausea. She scanned the crowd until her eyes landed on me, and she gestured for the technician to swing the spotlight in my direction. I was blinded momentarily by the harsh white light as she called my name in a voice dripping with faux affection. She announced that she wanted to honor her struggling baby sister with a special gift to help me get back on my feet. I took a deep breath and began my long walk toward the stage, knowing that this was the final act of her twisted play. The hands of the grandfather clock ticked past 8:15, signaling the moment Valerie had been anticipating all evening. The murmurs of the crowd died down as she beckoned me onto the platform with a gesture that looked welcoming to the audience, but felt like a summons to the gallows. I ascended the few steps to the stage while maintaining a composed expression that completely contradicted the turmoil churning in my stomach. Valerie wrapped an arm around my shoulders in a display of sisterly affection that made my skin crawl before signaling for the assistants to bring out the large gift box. It was wrapped in shimmering red paper and topped with an extravagant gold bow that glinted under the harsh stage lights. She handed me the heavy box with a flourish and announced into the microphone that she wanted to give me something that perfectly represented my contribution to the family legacy. The guests leaned in with polite curiosity as I slowly pulled the ribbon loose and lifted the lid to reveal the contents to the room. I tilted the box forward so that everyone in the front row could clearly see that the interior was completely and utterly empty. A few confused whispers broke out until Derek let out a loud braying laugh from the side of the stage, which prompted the rest of the sycophants to join in the mockery. Valerie leaned into the microphone with a triumphant smirk plastered across her face to deliver the punchline she had been rehearsing. She sneered, "See, Courtney, it's empty. That is all you deserve to receive from this family, a big round zero." The cruelty of her words hung in the air like a toxic cloud while she waited for me to burst into tears and run away in shame. However, I simply stared at the empty velvet lining of the box and felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I reached into my oversized clutch bag and withdrew the thick blue legal folder that I had guarded with my life since that morning. The room went silent as they watched me place the heavy document which contained the forensic accounting of her theft and our father's true last will directly into the center of the box. I looked up to meet her confused gaze and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who knows the game is finally over. I spoke clearly enough for the microphone to pick up my voice. "You are right, Valerie. This box is as empty as your character. But I will fill it with the truth. Here is the prosecution order and Dad's real will." I snapped the lid of the box shut with a definitive thud and shoved the entire package firmly against her chest so she had to grab it instinctively. I didn't wait for her response, as I turned on my heel and began to descend the stairs with the grace of a woman who has just reclaimed her life. Valerie stood frozen for a moment before her curiosity and arrogance got the better of her, and she ripped the lid back off to see what I had put inside. I was halfway to the double doors when the sound of rustling paper was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She must have seen the bank transfer logs with her name on them, or perhaps the signature on the arrest warrant that was sitting on top of the pile. A blood-curdling scream erupted from the stage that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being, as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She shrieked, "That's impossible! How could this be inside?" Her scream was the signal that shattered the illusion of her perfect evening and unleashed the chaos waiting just outside the gates. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a resounding crash that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. A dozen federal agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI swarmed into the room with their weapons drawn and their badges flashing under the lights. The guests screamed and scrambled toward the walls as the agents moved with military precision toward the stage where my sister was still clutching the box. Derek tried to make a run for the side exit but was tackled to the ground by two officers before he could even reach the curtains. I stopped at the threshold of the room and looked back just in time to see Valerie being handcuffed while still holding the evidence of her own destruction. 1 month after the scandal rocked Boston, the cypress trees on the estate grounds had begun to turn green again under the warm spring sunlight. The heavy iron gates that once guarded a fortress of lies were finally open to let in the fresh air of a new beginning. I stood on the front porch watching the last of the police tape being removed by the groundskeepers, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over the property for the first time in years. The legal proceedings against my sister and brother-in-law had been swift and brutal thanks to the overwhelming evidence I had provided in that red box. Valerie and Derek stood before the federal judge in orange jumpsuits that clashed horribly with their former arrogance and entitlement. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom as they were both sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The charges of embezzlement, forgery, and elder abuse were impossible to refute, especially when their own financial records were projected onto the screens for the jury to see. The judge also ordered the immediate seizure of all their personal assets, to pay restitution to the company they had bled dry for their selfish pleasures. Watching them being led away in handcuffs felt like watching a dark, suffocating cloud finally lift from my life. With the toxicity removed from our lives, I was able to bring Dad home to the estate where he belonged for his final days. We spent his remaining time sitting in the sunroom watching the garden he loved so much bloom into life. He didn't speak much because his strength was fading, but the peace in his eyes said everything I needed to know. He passed away gently in his sleep one Tuesday morning with a smile on his face, holding my hand until the very end. He left this world knowing that his life's work was safe, and that his name had been cleared of the shame Valerie brought upon it. It was a good death, the kind of dignified end he deserved after a lifetime of building a legacy for his family. Taking over the CEO office felt surreal at first, but I wasted no time in cleaning house to restore the company's integrity. I fired every single executive who had helped Valerie and Derek cover up their crimes or looked the other way for a paycheck. The boardroom was empty for a while, but I filled it with people who valued honesty over profit and hard work over nepotism. I walked across the street to Julian's glass tower, not as a desperate job seeker this time, but as an equal partner. We shook hands on a strategic partnership that would merge our logistics networks and dominate the East Coast market. Julian became my most trusted advisor, helping me rebuild the company on a foundation of transparency and ethical business practices that my father would have been proud of. I couldn't forget the woman who had risked her job and safety to give me the fighting chance I needed to save my father. I invited Brenda to the executive office and presented her with a check that would secure a comfortable retirement for her and her entire family. But I knew she wasn't ready to stop caring for people, so I asked her to run the new charitable foundation established in my father's name. She wept tears of joy and accepted the position immediately, promising to continue his legacy of kindness for decades to come. Before we end today's story, don't click away just yet, because I want to share a few personal thoughts on what we can learn from Courtney's journey. This story illustrates a brutal truth about human nature. Greed is a fire that consumes everything in its path, burning bridges and destroying the sacred bonds of family. Valerie had everything given to her wealth, status, and love, yet her hunger for more led to her losing her freedom and her soul. What I admire most about Courtney is her strategy of silence. In a world where everyone is screaming to be heard, she showed us that silence is not weakness. It is a weapon. She didn't fight dirty, she fought with facts. She waited for the perfect moment to let the truth speak for itself. It reminds us that no matter how deep you bury the truth under lies and money, it will always find a way to surface, sometimes in the form of an empty box that was never really empty at all. I have a question for you all. If you were in Courtney's shoes standing on that stage with the empty box, would you have been able to stay that calm, or would you have reacted differently? If you have a different way you would have handled that betrayal, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking the video and subscribing